Good to see you, everyone. My name is Robbie Howell, and normally I would have a theory crafting video ready for you today. However, schedule has been kicking my ass, and as such, I have something much shorter, but hopefully still interesting and theory crafting related prepared for you all now. The reason I have been having trouble getting out the content that I want to get out on the time frame that I want to get it out on is because I have a Kickstarter for my game Enclave. By the time this video goes live, it will have just 12 hours left. Wow! So if you're interested in tabletop games, please do check it out. It's a game I've been working on for over 9 years of my life. That means an awful lot to me. And we are at a whopping 166% funding as of time of this recording. So jump on in. We would love to have you there. Let's move on with today's video. Yes, as you know, I like to do theory crafting for Age of Empires 2 on this channel, talking about what civilizations could be added to the game hypothetically, and units, of course. And you may notice that a lot of the videos that I do involve subdividing an existing civilization and breaking it down into components that feel more appropriate and fitting rather than a massive umbrella. There have been a lot of such umbrella civilizations that we have tackled on this channel, but one that we've paid a decent amount of attention to that I think still has quite a lot of unexplored territory is the Saracens. I've done 2 builds on them already, and I think there's a lot more to go. So today, let us ask ourselves, how much can we split the Saracens? So with this keen question playing in your mind, I hope you enjoy today's brief video. Please be sure to share your opinions down below as always. And as mentioned, make sure to check out the Kickstarter for my game Enclave. Link in the description box as always. Let us begin. What have I done with a hypothetical Saracen split thus far? Well, first of all, I did a build for the Syrians, originally calling them the Umayyads. This was, I think, the 7th build I ever did on this channel. The Syrians are an infantry and defensive civilization with like a pretty strong navy as well. And they represent the Levant region, Islamic states more broadly, as well as the Syrians themselves, of course, and the Umayyad dynasty. It's a cool build that is very different from the current Saracens, but that is not all I have done. I've also done a build for the Egyptians. This was a more recent, but still at this point somewhat old build that primarily represented the Ayyubid dynasty and the Mamluk sultanates, both of which primarily operated out of Egypt. I was a little weirded out about using the name Egyptian when that has a lot more of an ancient connotation, but that's something that I discussed in that video. If you want to see either the Egyptians build or the Syrians build I just discussed, make sure to take a look up in the little linky thing up there. Now, the Egyptians as designed were an archer civilization with a pretty bad economy, but a very strong late game army comp. I thought they were really interesting, and they kind of had the same arc as the current Saracens do in-game. So they were kind of similar, and including a remade Mamluk unit, and also the cheaper market bonus directly ported. So that one was like a closer parallel to the Saracens that we see. But in addition to those two, I also created a regional unit, that being the Ziyar. This was on my Siege build. Go take a look at that up there. And this was a unique upgrade to the Siege crossbow unit that I proposed. The Ziyar was faster and a little squishier than what you would normally get, but also had some unique anti-cavalry properties, giving it a very distinctive niche, though as I mentioned in that video, I was not perfectly happy with the historicity of the unit. And lastly, the Caravanserai. This is a building I've mentioned on many builds at this point. The Middle Eastern powers would possibly have the Caravanserai, though certainly not all of them, I would say. It's definitely more of a Silk Road style building, but it definitely would be present on a couple of these civilizations, so I thought I would mention it. And it would be roughly similar to what we see in the game right now, but largely buffed up and applicable to all units besides just trade, with some trade-offs to compensate. So where do we go from here? What more can be done with a hypothetical Saracen split than these 2 builds, 1 unit, and kind of a building that I have already proposed in past videos? Well, I have a couple of other options for you. Let's begin with some of the top contenders that I have found in my own personal research. I should preface this by saying that, as always, I am far from a historian, and on top of that, I have not done a proper deep dive onto any of these civilizations or units, as I will get to shortly. These are mostly things that I have seen come up in research for some of my other builds, and things that people have said down in the comments section that I thought were relevant enough to bear mentioning here and now. Let's jump in. First of all, Arabians, or Arabs, whichever one you want to call them. This would be the new default Saracen civilization, like how the Hindustanis became the new default to the former Indians. And I thought that they could primarily represent the Abbasid Caliphate. Obviously, the Abbasids were around for a very long time, and they were the quintessential Arab Islamic state of the Middle Ages. It seems like an obvious shoo-in, but that's not to say I would just be taking the current Saracens and directly porting them. Oh, no, 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 you know, I am not that simple. My thought is that this would be a camel and siege civilization, kind of like we see with the Saracens right now. They're kind of taking a siege direction these days. But I was thinking more of a mid-game focus rather than a late-game focus, and fewer weird, quirky, goofy things than I would normally like to put on a civilization. I think it could be quite cool to show the transition from the early Arab days of nomad tactics to the more organized armies that you see in the 800s and 900s and beyond. Like in the early days of the Islamic caliphates, the Arabs used these amazing hit-and-run tactics, blitzing into a location, obliterating it, and then blitzing back out. It's the main way they conquered Persia. But I think that's the most obvious contender. I'm surely going to get to that at some point. There's a couple others I think are also great picks, including the Andalusians. As you may know, there were quite a few powerful Islamic states in Spain. We see them represented in the El Cid campaign, the Emirate of Cordoba, Granada later on, and most of these were primarily of Umayyad origin, but they very much evolved into their own thing and lasted well into the 1400s AD, a number that still blows my mind whenever I see it, allowing us to show off an Islamic state with a later time frame. So I think that, at a guess, if I were to design an Andalusian civ, it would likely be kind of a late-game civilization with a very defensive focus, kind of like the Byzantines or Chinese, in that would also have a substantial focus on technology and maybe progressing through the ages faster. And while I don't think it's as obvious of a pick as an Arab civilization, I think I like this one even more just from like a flavor and feel perspective. It could also allow us to bring up an interesting diplomacy dynamic, because as we saw in the El Cid campaign, the relationship between Christian Spain and Muslim Spain was far from black and white. Now, beyond these two, there are a couple other contenders that I think would be great additions, even if they're not quite as obvious. One being the Tunisians. Now, name me, if you can, what great Islamic dynasty ruled out of Tunisia. That would be the Fatimids, primarily from like the 900s to 1100s-ish AD. They did eventually conquer and rule out of Egypt, but they were originally Tunisian and seemed to mostly kind of move their base of power to Egypt because of prestige. Most interestingly about the Fatimids, they were Shia Muslims, allowing us some really cool cultural variety. I think that a Tunisian civilization would probably be some sort of camel and navy civilization. Kind of like how the current Saracens do have some focus on navy, like quite a good navy even. I think that the Tunisians could focus deeper into that than I do with even something like the Umayyads, as well as having an aggressive playstyle, particularly because this new Fatimid state neighbored a lot of existing Berber tribes and assimilated quite a few of them, from what I understand, allowing kind of an interesting hybrid between what we see in the Berbers and what we see in the current Saracens, and trying to get something new from that union. And lastly, of my top contenders, I would put to you the Yemenis. This is one that I didn't know was really a thing in the Middle Ages. Like, obviously, I know what Yemen is, but the Yemeni were actually like a presence in the Middle Ages. Oh, yes, they were. In fact, the Himyarite dynasty was present well before the AoE2 relevant time frame and even fought the Romans, from what I understand. The Himyarites hit their peak in like 525 at the beginning of the AoE2 relevant time frame. And even though the area was conquered by a ton of different like Islamic caliphates, and the Yemenis did like convert to Islam, I think almost universally, there was still a lot of holdout kingdoms of native Yemenis who would rebel and resist the incursions of the incoming Arab overlords. And did so very effectively, to the degree that Yemen, if I understand correctly, was never once fully conquered. There was like all these interesting holdouts and unconquerable highland strongholds. They even had ties to Judaism that really surprised me, though of course that will require digging into a lot deeper. And it seems like their military largely focused on guerrilla warfare, which I find fascinating and can lend itself to some really interesting civilization designs. So I think they would probably be similar to my recent Wends build that I did with collaborator Tomasz Staniak. They would be like an early game raiding and skirmishing civilization that tried to take map control and then moved into a more defensive late game. But we can make them play very, very different from the Wends, I assure you. So that's 4 decent civilizations on top of the 2 that I have built. I think that all of these would be absolutely sweet additions, but I have a couple more besides. Let me share with you a couple of long shots. Now, these are ones that I really need to research more before I can give a final decision on, but if it seems like the history is there to justify them being added to the game, by my standards at least, I would love to include them. Let's begin with the Bedouins. Now, obviously the Bedouins are Arabs or Arabian, at least from what I understand. Maybe there is an ethnic distinction within that I'm not really processing, but it does seem like the distinction between city-dwelling Arabs and desert-dwelling Arabs has given rise to a very long-standing rivalry that existed even well into the early Middle Ages. You could argue that the earliest Rashidun Caliphate was Bedouin in origin, since it does seem to have largely originated out of more desert-dwelling Arab peoples. But even past the Rashiduns, the Bedouins played a very substantial role in Islamic politics. They come up all the time in my research for civilizations like the Syrians. And this is probably because while they were a bunch of disorganized nomads, they were absolutely ferocious warriors and raiders with a proud cultural tradition and an absolute stranglehold on some of the only trade and travel routes throughout the Arabian Peninsula. My guess is if the Bedouins were to be added, they would probably be some sort of early game camel civilization that did a lot of raiding, but further research may prove otherwise. I think the Bedouins, even though I do think they're kind of a long shot and I just don't know enough about them, would be sick. They sound so cool. But the last longest shot I wanted to discuss was the Iraqis. Now, Iraq, or specifically Baghdad, was very, very important in the Middle Ages. It was pretty much the Abbasid capital. And so my thought for the Iraqis was maybe they could be the civilization to kind of represent the Abbasid dynasty, the Abbasid Caliphate. That would obviously give them a lot of impact. But what would the Arabians or Arabs do instead of representing the Abbasids? Well, they could fill in the gaps. Obviously, there's going to be a ton of Islamic, Arabian, or Arab adjacent peoples who aren't covered in the civilizations I've discussed. And so having some catch-all umbrella for all of the smaller states or things that I didn't cover in this analysis seems like a fairly reasonable idea to me, especially because this could kind of allow for some unifying threads between some of the other Saracen split civilizations, which even if not optimal to my perfectionist mind, seems like a reasonable compromise. That all being said, I don't really know what the Iraqis would be like beyond this Abbasid link. I definitely would need to do a lot more research to see if they have a distinct enough history besides this to really feel like they're more justified, because otherwise it feels cleaner to just give the Abbasid dynasty to the Arabs. I still think they're a very intriguing option, and I'd really like to make them work. Man, my light's bright. Let me tone this down. Now, moving on. We've covered now 6 civilizations in addition to the 2 I have met. I want to talk about a couple of regionals, specifically regional units, buildings, and technologies that could be shared among some or all of these hypothetical Saracen split civilizations. Before I do so, look at this dude in the bottom right. What's he doing? It's like he's using his head as a slingshot. I love it. Anyways, jumping into regionals. First of all, camel units. It's been discussed at length from what I have seen in comments and in the Discord. Join that, by the way, link in the description down below. We do all sorts of fun stuff that you will be seeing more and more of on this channel. Anyways, it's been discussed at length that the current camel line doesn't really feel sufficient to encompass the breadth of camel-based warfare, but similarly, it also seems like Age of Empires and other strategy games dramatically overplay just how much camels were actually used in warfare. It's a really tricky line to travel, and as such, I don't think that any of these camel units are absolute shoo-ins. Besides, camel scouts. They really, really deserve to be on many more civilizations than they are now. But beyond the camel scout, camel archers. It's a lot of back and forth on whether these things even existed. And if so, how they were used. From what I have seen, emphasis on that, it does seem like they were used quite broadly, in addition to by the Berbers, where they currently are. The Arabs definitely used them, particularly in the early days, like the Bedouin-style desert-dwelling Arabs definitely used camel archers. But they probably didn't fire from camel back. They probably rode the camel to get a position, hopped off, shot, and then hopped back on. So we would call this like a mounted infantry-style cavalry archer. Much akin to what the 1300s era English did with their longbowmen. Almost all longbowmen during that era had a horse that they would use to reposition themselves. The horses are very useful, as it turns out. And so I think a camel archer could fit. We just need to be like a little cautious with how they were implemented, trying not to either overcomplicate them or simplify them to just being cavalry archer but camel. Similarly, camel lancers, maybe like a step lancer but on a camel. It's possible. It seems probable that spears were used on camelback at times. And like I said, the desert-dwelling Arabs were absolutely infamous for their camel-based guerrilla warfare. And so some sort of like faster raiding or blitzing camel unit seems appropriate, but maybe just has a unique for them. And lastly, the imperial camel. I like that the Hindustanis have it, but like with the Camel Scout, I think it deserves to be a little more broad-reaching. Maybe the Hindustanis could have a unique version. I just want to give the more committed, true camel civs a nice payoff to teching into such a weird unit. And I think the Imperial Camel is a decent iteration of that. Not sold on any of these as mentioned, though. Now, another thing, the Hashashin. The famous order of assassins. The Hashashin were a subset of a similar group called the Nizari. It was a religious sect that I'm not going to go into the history of because I think I will butcher it off the top of my head. And the Hashashin, of course, would be the famous assassin unit. You know what they are, I'm sure. And there's a ton of ways you could take a unit like this. One idea I had is like the Dark Templar route, if you know StarCraft, where they have low HP and a great cloak, but deal like absolutely massive damage. And so like they have perfect stealth except within like certain capacities and just go around one-shotting villagers or something. That's a cool idea. Potential to be broken in Age of Empires, much more so than in StarCraft. Another idea is what if they're like a decent damage unit that can like garrison in enemy buildings to kill units before they're even made. That could be cool too. Or what if instead of being a unit, the Hashashin, you like use a flare on the map and like the unit appears there and does something and then vanishes. Maybe it's like a command rather than a unit. There's so many ways you can take this. I think it's pretty much mandatory that we add something like this to the Saracen split style civilizations at some point. But until then, all I can present to you is some of my loose ramblings. Let's talk about some other regional options. The muttawi'ah. This was detailed on my Egyptians build. This would be a religious cannon fodder unit. Kind of like a Karambit warrior, but trained from the monastery. And also quite cheap, even cheaper than a Karambit, but definitely wouldn't have the whole half population thing. This was coming from the idea of like religious conscripts that joined many Islamic armies, particularly from what I saw in like the 1000s, 1100s and onward, like the Crusades era. The Islamic armies gathered a lot of support from their side, much in the same way as the Crusaders could just pick up peasants wherever they go. Really cool idea. I think it would give the Saracen civilizations a lot of flavor, but I'm not quite as sold on it as something like the Hashashin. Another idea, a unique building called a desert palace, particularly during the Umayyad dynasty, but I believe also in other dynasties later on. Many royal, well-to-do people would build these absolutely elaborate luxury villas out in the middle of nowhere that were very expensive to maintain and had like water and stuff and like luxuries carted into them by the truckload. My idea with the desert palace is like maybe it could be like some sort of defensive fortification building, but it was kind of a crappy fortification, but it would spawn units as it was hurt to represent guards like flooding out to defend the desert palace. I originally proposed this on my Syrians build, by the way. The one problem is I wasn't sure of a good way to like incentivize the enemy attacking the desert palace because like I didn't want it to have an arrow style attack. Maybe like a gold trickle, so they're like, oh, I got to destroy this economic building. But when I do so, it spawns a ton of units. I don't know. Could be interesting. I'm less sold on this than any of the others I've mentioned. And lastly, madrasa. I originally talked about this on my Egyptians build as well. Madrasas were like religious universities, for want of a better term. Centers of learning, both of a religious and secular nature. Most famously set up by Salah ad-Din, but they were used in a number of other places within the Islamic world as well. And I think they would have to be some sort of monastery-university merger combo thing. Either like a building that consolidates the two, or maybe just a technology. Again, a lot of ways you could take this. I don't have a really crystallized idea for it yet. doesn't really hold a camel to doesn't really hold a camel to camel units. Doesn't really hold a candle to camel units, Hashashin, or the muttawi'ah. But yeah, those are some ideas for units, buildings, technologies that I would personally strongly consider adding to more members of a Saracen split, as well as retroactively adding them to some of the ones that we have done. But with that, we come to the end of this short breakdown video. Oh God, oh geez, oh my Lord. Hi. Sorry, my slideshow program bugged out on me. Yeah, what do you guys think of these ideas for future potential Saracen-style civilizations, units, etc.? Do you think I missed any obvious picks for civilizations or regionals or similar? And how far would you personally take a Saracen split? You know me, I'm a more the merrier kind of guy. I would totally split the Saracens into 8 civilizations. I wouldn't even blink. I'll do it now, watch. But seriously, I'd love to hear how far you would personally take it, what your thoughts are on my current picks and plans. This is obviously a bit of a teaser for some future episodes, but I will say, as always, I'm going to try my best to read comments despite how busy things have been recently, and if you guys have ideas and thoughts and contributions, I'm going to try my best to take account of them for future reference. So, share your thoughts. I love reading them when I have time. And a reminder, we have a Recraft stream this coming Sunday. It's going to be a lot of stuff to get through, and especially after this campaign, I'm not sure how much I'll be able to get done, but I'm going to be trying my best to present you guys with a bunch of cool updates to civilizations that I have built in the past that are getting some fresh coats of paint and some balance changes based on all of your fantastic suggestions. So join me then, noon Eastern Standard Time. Going to be streaming, should be a grand old time. But until then, my name is Robbie Howell, and ciao for now.